Love is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen's. Love is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen.
In this Black Mestory series, we take an in-depth look at the region of West Africa, defined in a broad context as being as far north as Mauritania and as far east as Chad, with the Central African Republic and the southeast curving into Cameroon. The fifth part in our series on West Africa looks at what was happening across our previously identified region in the 19th century of the Common Era, following on from what we covered in part 4 of this series when we looked at West Africa between 1500 and 1800. In part 4 we looked at how ships from various European countries began arriving at all points around the West African coastline, seeking to do trade with the Africans they found on the south coast in various natural resources of the land, including, amongst other things, peppers, grains, gold, ivory, and increasingly for slaves. This 300-year period was where the transatlantic slave trade really took off, with Britain emerging in the middle of the 17th century as the major player in the traffic of Africans for the slave markets of the Caribbean and North America, which would spark, particularly in the southernmost part of the West African region, least affected by the Arab presence further north, many instances of conflicts between neighbouring and or former friendly village states as they sought to meet the Europeans' increased demand for slave stock to fill their ships. Britain would eventually start repatriating former slaves who were known as the Black Poor of London before the end of the century, having negotiated possession of territory on the coast in modern-day Sierra Leone. But the ships of the European privateers would continue to arrive at key points on the West African coast, demanding more slaves to fill their ships. Moroccans from the north invaded into Mali midway through this 300-year period, seeking to take control of the Saharan trade route, possibly motivated by a fear that the Portuguese were about to gain access through the contacts they were beginning to make at that time in Mauritania and Senegal. But they would finally be driven out just before the end of the 18th century, around the same time as when British explorer Mungo Park became the first white European to reach the River Niger. So going through the first few years of the 19th century of the Common Era in West Africa, the Fulani, who, as we discussed in part 4, had just decades before arrived in northern Cameroon after a gradual migration across the whole region, continued their incursion into Bono territory, crossing Lake Chad to finally defeat the Bono Empire in their base in Chad by 1810. Britain had a few years before this abolished the transatlantic slave trade, meaning that the practice of transporting Africans across the ocean for the purpose of slavery had become illegal, and its government had begun lobbying other European powers to follow suit. Having secured a small number of agreements with some of the European nations, Britain sent a squadron of ships to be stationed at their Province of Freedom territory at present-day Sierra Leone. It was their duty from 1810 to intercept and seize any ships that were flying the relevant national flags if they were found to have had been transporting slaves. The slaves on board were rescued and taken to the newly expanded British colony, which they named Sierra Leone, as the Portuguese had called it when they first arrived in the 15th century. Some of those rescued were also transported to the Caribbean. These Africans would be caused to serve as indentured workers, aiding the development of this new British colony. A decade later, around 1820, The USA would follow the example set by the British in negotiating territory on the west coast at the place they called Liberia. The plan was to use the colony for relocating Black American freemen and former slaves who wished to be repatriated, something that would infuriate the Africans who were local, as it meant the disruption of their slave trading activities with the Europeans on the coast, causing the new settlements to face regular attacks. Governed over by a series of white American leaders, it would be another 20 years before the territory would see its first non-white governor elected, and the calming of the uneasy situation on the ground. France, who had reintroduced slavery after a decade, a few years into the new century after the Napoleonic dynasty was reinstated, began forcing the people of the Senegal colony to become engaged in the mass production of peanuts around 1820, virtually at the expense of all other crops. The venture would turn out to be a failure, but the French would use their presence in the territory to take control over a large portion of the modern inland Senegal by 1840. By the middle of the century, with France having by now abolished slavery after the fall of Napoleon III, they entered a campaign to create more settlements on the West African coast, targeting Guinea, Ivory Coast, and modern-day Benin, even resorting to military penetration in the case of Guinea. The Black Americans of Liberia, which was effectively a semi-autonomous colony of the USA, having succeeded in maintaining their small nation under non-white rule for a decade by then, began to make a unilateral declaration of independence, which both Britain and France recognized. But the American government itself would not accept their claim at this time. In the early 1860s, with the American Revolution in full swing, the USA finally recognized the independence of Liberia. By 1870, with all the European powers operating around the West African coast now having seized their business in slave trade, Britain found itself to be the only one with base still in operation off the coast of present-day Ghana. It would take this as an opportunity to negotiate with Akan leaders on the mainland for possession of territory on the coast to form a colony which they would call the Gold Coast. Further east along the West African coastline at present-day Benin, the French began to take steps to establish a firmer grip on the territory, reaching deeper inland. A decade later, in the territory of modern-day Guinea, the Wassoulou, or Mandinka Empire, led by the infamous Samori Touré, would rise up against the French colonial army based there, even gaining some significant victories in their many battles with them. Germany, which had missed out on the economical gains made by the more seafaring Western European nations during the slave trading era, were determined not to be left behind this time and began sending expeditions to Africa. In West Africa specifically, they negotiated with the leaders of Togo, which included Eastern Ghana at that time, and Cameroon in 1884 for possession of land at the coast to hold as a protectorate, gradually working their way in both cases inland over the following years. The unofficial scramble for Africa by the Europeans had already started, and impressed with the results coming back from out of their colonies, Bismarck, the German leader, wanted to make things more official with agreements that would be struck up amongst the European powers at the Berlin Conference held in 1885 to carve up the whole continent for their control. The results from this conference can be seen through their actions in the following few years as they begun trying to penetrate territories further inland. In 1890, the French penetrated deeper into Ivory Coast and claimed Mali as its own colony, whilst in neighbouring Burkina Faso, they also entered into a military campaign for control of the land in competition with the British, who came up from Ghana, and the Germans, who came up from Togo. French attempts to penetrate deeper into the modern-day Benin was met with fierce opposition from the local Africans in the north. The British, who had already held some missionary-type presence in present-day Nigeria, boosted by the agreements achieved at the Berlin Conference, took possession of that territory, claiming it, in principle at least, as a colony. The French had also been active south of our identified West African region, penetrating into Gabon through to Congo before arriving in the Central African Republic, meeting competition from the Germans, who were able to approach the territory from their Cameroon colony, and the Belgians, who were in control of the neighbouring so-called Congo Free State, which is modern-day DR Congo. After negotiations with the Belgians, France was granted possession of this territory, and from there they would enter into a military campaign for control of Chad further north. By 1900, the French victory in Chad had finally been achieved, accompanied by the success that they had in their war with the Wassoulou Empire in Guinea, causing them to retreat into northern Ivory Coast. But the French would not be prepared to leave things there, as they followed the Wassoulou into the Ivory Coast and inflicted a final defeat on them there. The Wassoulou Empire's leader, Samori Touré, would be exiled to Gabon, as mentioned before, a French-controlled territory outside of our identified West African region. Having achieved actual control of the territory, the French set about agreeing borderlines between their French Guinea territory and their neighbouring British-controlled Sierra Leone. The three territories in West Africa that had remained untainted by a definite European dominance and influence, that being Mauritania, Nigeria, and to a lesser extent Burkina Faso, all would be handed into the French sphere of influence. Britain started to assert its perceived authority over its claimed territories of the Gold Coast and Nigeria by invading into Ashanti territory in the northern portion of the present-day Ghana and removing the company it had appointed to administer over the land in Nigeria to take a more direct form of control over its affairs there. The 19th century sees a change in the relationship with Africa as a whole, as the transatlantic slave trade begins to decline and abolition in the slave states of the America becomes a reality. In West Africa specifically, France and Britain began negotiating treaties with the local leaders right around the coastline of the region, from Senegal to Benin, by the middle of the century, for the rights to establish settlements on the coast to support, in the view of the Africans at least, future trading relations. USA also negotiated possession of Liberia, modelled on Britain's Sierra Leone colony, with Liberia becoming an independent state within 50 years. Germany would complete Europe's total colonialization of the West African coastline, excluding Liberia and Mauritania, in 1884, the year before the Berlin Conference, which legitimized, in the eyes of the Europeans, the carving up of Africa for their own benefit. The agreed French slice of the West African cake would prove to be bigger than that of other European nations showing a presence in the region, as it took possession of all the territory lying inland, going around from Central African Republic to Chad and then westwards to Mauritania.
Love It's like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen's love. It's like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen.